Welcome to episode 143 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's March 23rd, 1980. We're in Italy, Serie A and Serie B, and today's story is about the day footballers walked off the pitch and into police custody. Because on this day in 1980, the Totonero betting scandal exploded into public view when the Guardia di Finanza moved into Italian stadiums, arrested players and a club president, and turned whispers about fixed matches into one of the most humiliating spectacles in Calcio history. But how did we get here? We start with the uncomfortable truth. Match fixing was not invented in Italy in 1980. Football had already learned, decades earlier, that wherever money and uncertainty meet, corruption follows close behind. In England, Liverpool and Manchester United players had fixed a First Division match in 1915. In Italy, scandal had stained the game long before Totonero too. The names change, the mechanism barely does. Bets, debts, pressure, opportunity. And after the Second World War, Italy created a system that made football and gambling even more tightly bound. In 1946 came the schedina sisal, later known to generations as Totocalcio, the pool's coupon that became a national ritual. You filled in your little grid, dreamed of a jackpot, and in the process tied football even more tightly to speculation. It was legal, state-linked, mainstream, almost domestic, but that only sharpened the appetite for something else. Faster money, darker money, money on specific matches rather than a whole coupon. That was the paradox. The legal pools normalized football betting as part of public life. The illegal market offered more precision, more speed, and more temptation. And the logic spread well beyond Italy. Even the Intertoto Cup, founded in 1961, was built partly to keep football pools operators supplied with summer fixtures. The game and the gambling ecosystem were not just neighbors, they were structurally intertwined. By the late 1970s, Italy offered especially fertile ground. Calcio was glamorous, tribal, heavily covered, and deeply emotional. But it also sat inside a wider national climate of distrust, informal power, and blurred lines between public respectability and private arrangement. Italian football had long carried what one academic history calls a crisis of legitimacy. Referees were mistrusted, institutions were mistrusted, and everyone suspected someone else had access to a back door. That does not mean every scandal was run by the mafia, but it does mean the illegal betting economy and criminal networks understood football as exploitable terrain. And into that world stepped two very unglamorous protagonists. Alvaro Trinca was a restaurateur in Rome. Massimo Cruciani was a fruit and vegetable wholesaler. Trinca's restaurant, La Lampara, near Piazza del Popolo, was frequented by players, especially from Lazio. That mattered, because proximity is often the first corruption infrastructure, not gangsters in a dark alley, but familiar faces at a favorite table. The first match they are said to have manipulated was a friendly between Palermo and Lazio on November 1st, 1979. The result landed as arranged. That success encouraged the next step. Then came a more serious operation, Milan against Lazio, on January 6, 1980, a match the betting ring also managed to bend. But here is the key thing about corruption schemes. They rarely stay elegant. Once more money enters, more moving pieces enter, more greed, more panic, more chances for the plan to misfire. And that is what happened. Some games under suspicion did not unfold the way the bettors needed. Losses mounted, debts mounted, and pressure mounted. And by early 1980, what had looked like a clever black market operation was becoming dangerous, even to the men running it. A journalist at Paese Sera, Giuliano Prasca, had already reported in January on a clandestine gambling ring in football. And then, on March 1st, Trinca and Cruciani filed a complaint with prosecutors in Rome, naming players and clubs. In other words, the scandal did not break because football cleaned itself. It broke because the scheme began collapsing under its own weight. So by late March, investigators were ready. And on Sunday, March 23, 1980, they chose theater. That matters. Because if Italian football had for years existed in a fog of rumor, coded accusation, and private suspicion, the state now decided to make the scandal public in the most visual way possible. Not later, not quietly, not by summons in an office, but in stadiums, on match day in front of cameras. And at the end of matches including Milan against Torino, Roma against Perugia, Pescara against Lazio, and Avellino against Cagliari, and Palermo against Genoa in Serie B, officers moved in. Players were taken from dressing rooms and corridors. Milan president Felice Colombo was arrested too. Some of the most recognizable names included Enrico Albertosi and Giorgio Morini of Milan, Bruno Giordano, Lionello Manfredonia, Massimo Cacciatore, and Giuseppe Wilson of Lazio, Mauro della Martira and Luciano Cecchini of Perugia, Stefano Pellegrini of Avellino, Sergio Ghirari of Genoa, and Guido Macchiarini of Palermo. Others, including Paolo Rossi, will receive summons and later sanctions rather than that same locker room arrest scene. And this, more than anything, is why Totonero lodged itself so deeply in football memory. The image, players in tracksuits, police beside the tunnel, a president in handcuffs, and the next morning, the newspapers screaming that there had been manette negli stadi, handcuffs in the stadiums. Italian football had not merely been accused of dishonesty, it had been publicly stripped of dignity. The scandal itself became known as Totonero, black bets, dark betting, the shadow side of Totocalcio. And then came the two-track aftermath, criminal justice and sporting justice. The criminal side moved slowly, and in the end, weakly. Prosecutors pursued the case, but by December 1980, the criminal court acquitted the defendants because the legal framework was not really built to punish what sport knew had happened. That is one of the deepest lessons of the scandal. The game could feel the corruption. The law struggled to define it. Sporting justice moved much faster. The Italian football authorities opened their own process almost immediately. By the summer of 1980, punishments were severe. Milan and Lazio were relegated to Serie B. Avellino, Bologna, Perugia, Palermo, and Taranto were docked points. Felice Colombo was thrown out of the game. Enrico Albertosi received a long ban. Bruno Giordano, Lionello Manfredonia, and others were suspended. Paolo Rossi, perhaps the biggest individual name drawn into the scandal, was banned for 3 years, later reduced on appeal to 2. And that part matters enormously, because Rossi denied wrongdoing, because many in Italy thought the sporting process was uneven, and because football history, in its perverse way, was already setting up one of its great reversals. But before we get to Rossi, stay for a second with the institutional wound. What Totonero shattered was not just reputations, it shattered trust. Trust in results, in the betting environment, in club officials, and in the federation's ability to police its own house. And if you're wondering whether the handcuffs cleaned the game up once and for all, the answer is not really. They punished people, they embarrassed the system, they created a warning, but they didn't remove the underlying incentives. And in fact, 6 years later, Italy had Totonero again. But so what? Well, first, Totonero 1980 exposed the gap between spectacle and governance in one of Europe's grandest football cultures. Italian football could produce stars, crowds, drama, and mythology, but its institutions were far less convincing when asked to guarantee integrity. And second, it changed individual lives completely. Take Paolo Rossi. In 1980, he was not just another player. He was already one of the biggest names in Italian football, a World Cup star from 1978 and one of the country's most valuable attacking talents. The scandal cost him 2 years after appeal. It ruled him out of Euro 1980 on home soil. It stained his name. And when Enzo Bearzot picked him for the 1982 World Cup after only 3 Serie A appearances following his return, Italy erupted in argument. And then Rossi scored 6 goals in Spain, 3 against Brazil, 2 against Poland, and 1 in the final against West Germany. He finished as World Cup top scorer and tournament Golden Ball winner. So yes, one of the strangest afterlives of Totonero is that it forms a dark prologue to one of Italy's brightest football fairy tales. Third, the scandal didn't kill Milan. It humiliated Milan. It sent Milan down. It damaged the club's name. But it didn't kill it. In 1986, Silvio Berlusconi bought the club, and that purchase became the starting point for one of the great club dynasties of the modern game. OTD episode 112 was about that, definitely worth listening to. So the story runs from disgrace to reinvention, which is part of what makes Milan such a fascinating institution. Fourth, the bigger problem never disappeared. Modern anti-corruption bodies are explicit about this. Match fixing remains a global threat. International organizations such as the Council of Europe, the UNODC, and Interpol all frame manipulation of sporting contests as a live issue, often linked to illegal betting markets and organized crime. And the online era has not simplified that problem. It has widened the market, accelerated the flow of money, and created more betting angles than the old pools generation could have imagined. But is there a way to get rid of this entirely? Probably not. Not as long as the sport contains uncertainty that can be monetized. What you can do is narrow the space in which corruption works. Better laws, better monitoring, better cooperation between police federations and betting operators, faster intelligence sharing, more protection for whistleblowers, and a culture where players understand how quickly just one favor becomes a career-ending decision. Totonero didn't solve that puzzle, but it forced football to admit the puzzle existed. Before we go, 3 things to take away from March 23, 1980. First, Totonero was not an isolated freak event. It sat inside a much longer history of match fixing, gambling culture, and institutional vulnerability in football. Second, what made March 23rd so unforgettable was the visibility. The state turned a corruption investigation into a public spectacle, arresting players and a president in and around stadiums and making football's dirt impossible to deny. And third, the scandal changed careers and institutions, but it didn't eliminate the disease. Paolo Rossi turned suspension into redemption, and Milan turned relegation into eventual rebirth. But football itself never escaped the problem of manipulation. On this day in 1980, Italian police entered the stadiums, handcuffed footballers and a club president, and forced Calcio to confront the dark betting economy growing around it. The day Totonero stopped being rumor and became a national reckoning. That's all for episode 143, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a 5-star rating, and share it with a fellow football historian. Tomorrow, we go back 15 years to March 24, 1965, when Liverpool and Köln, unable to settle the European Cup tie after 3 matches, turned to the toss of a wooden chip, which, in one of football's strangest details, landed on its edge before fate finally chose a side. See you tomorrow.